Thank you all for coming today and for permitting me to move the program a week forward from when it usually is. Benefits some of you, but thank you for staying with a moving target. Since baseball season has begun, I'll use a baseball analogy, the first of the season, that I am pinch hitting today for my former colleague Tom Seabrook. He was the one who conceived this talk and gave it the title and the description that you may very well have seen. But I've done a lot of talking on this subject over the years, so able to step in relatively easily. So we all know that the monuments have been in the news, not only in Richmond, but well beyond, more now than ever. But of course, this is Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, the city that can't get over the Civil War, so there's nothing new about that. In the 25 or 28 years that I've been in Richmond, there hasn't been a time that monuments and symbols have not been in the news one way or another. So nothing new there. But it has become more of a national issue. And I'll be talking about the issue itself for the majority of this program. But first I want to do a quick tour of the Civil War, specifically Confederate monuments in Richmond, not just as a public service, but also to set up the discussion of the meatier, more controversial aspects of it. And because this is such a controversial topic, I'm going to be hewing more closely to my script than usual so that I don't say anything careless, but also so that I can stick to my time and avoid the temptation to go off on tangents. So no further ado, and if you want, the tour I'm about to give you, by the way, is a partial one. Not as long as the one that you'll see on that handout, so I'm not going to be mentioning all those monuments, and I'm going to skip the dedication dates, even though I do have them committed to memory, so that a fewer words that I'll be giving to you. So let's start with the most famous aggregation of monuments, Civil War Confederate monuments in Richmond, that on Monument Avenue. So we'll go from east to west, starting with, of course, Jeb Stuart. And then the first of the monuments on Monument Avenue, the granddaddy of them all by scale anyway, Robert E. Lee, created in 1890 when there really was no Monument Avenue, as there wouldn't be formally for another 15 years. And then further west, Jefferson Davis. This is not my photograph, a nice dramatic view of the Jefferson Davis Monument at what used to be Cedar Street, now Davis Avenue. Stonewall Jackson, at the Boulevard, of course. And the guy on the globe, Matthew Fontaine Maury, who most of you, if you passed by it, you wouldn't know there was a Confederate monument because it doesn't say anything about the Confederacy, but it is a Confederate monument. That's the sum total of most visitors' knowledge, really, of Confederate monuments in Richmond, Monument Avenue or Monument Street or Monument Alley. People from outside the area always get it wrong. But we who live here know that there's a lot more, but you might not know just how many there are, and that is part of the program today. Beginning in Hollywood Cemetery, Confederate monument to the Confederate dead in Hollywood Cemetery, erected in 1869, the very first Civil War monument, really, in Richmond. A lot of monuments of sorts, depending on how you define monuments, in Hollywood Cemetery, but one that I should show you is that of Jefferson Davis, the site of his grave in 1899, dedicated not long after his reinterment. And my wife would kill you if I didn't show you another one, to Winnie Davis, Verena Ann Davis, his daughter, also erected over her grave in 1899. And then another aggregation of monuments that people kind of tend to take for granted. You sit and eat your lunch by them, but you don't really see them sometimes. That to Stonewall Jackson, the very earliest of the Confederate monuments erected in public spaces in Richmond. In fact, it was conceived in 1863 by the English Friends of the Confederacy, who raised the money for it immediately upon hearing of Jackson's death and shipped it over to Richmond, and it was dedicated and unveiled in 1875. You might be able to see behind it kind of a partially completed building, which gives you a good idea of the date of this interesting photograph, because behind it, of course, today is the old City Hall. So it dates that other photograph to the 1880s as Old City Hall was still going up. But here's Jackson, of course, looking to his right, like as if he's trying to avoid looking to his left at the man who took off his left arm, Hunter Holmes McGuire, the doctor, the surgeon for the medical director of Jackson's Corps. Of course, Hunter McGuire was known for a lot of other things other than being the medical director of Jackson's Corps. He was, a lot of you who are associated with MCV know him for his association with the Medical College of Virginia. Another fellow in Capitol Square who's known for things other than being a Confederate, he's known for his barbecue. Extra Billy Smith, who was a two-time governor of Virginia, one reason he's in Capitol Square, but he was also a Confederate general in Pickett's division, Pickett's charge, and he is commemorated in part for that. So I consider this to be at least in part a Confederate monument. And inside the House of Delegates chamber, the old House of Delegates chamber, is a monument to R.E. Lee erected on the spot where he assumed command of Virginia's forces. So there's a couple inside, which swells that list you have somewhat. Some people may cry foul on that, but I'm considering them because of their prominence. He is surrounded in that room by a sculpture gallery of famous Virginians, including Jefferson Davis, again. Not a Virginian at all, except the years he was here. But Alexander Stephens, his vice president, is also in there. But there are a lot of non-Virginians in this gallery of busts of famous Virginians in the old House of Delegates chamber. And we're not accustomed to thinking of Monroe Park as being a site of Confederate monuments, but it is. William C. Wickham, not Wickman, Wickham, Confederate general of a brigade of cavalry under Jeb Stuart. And we tend to think of Joseph Bryan as the founder of the Times-Dispatch and an industrialist, which he was, and that's certainly why this monument is in Monroe Park. But he was also a soldier as a young man in Mosby's cavalry, Mosby's Rangers. And let's go north side. The only statue to a Confederate under which that Confederate is buried, outside Hollywood Cemetery, of course. In other cemeteries, A.P. Hill on north side, built as something of a speculation property development by one of his staff officers, Lewis Ginter, in Ginter Park. So we go from north side to what was then the West End, what is now VCU, and Howitzer's Park at Grove and Park and Harrison Street. Richmond Howitzer's unit, commemorated by a statue by the same man who did the A.P. Hill statue, William Ludwell Shepard, who also erected the statue on the East End, the one you can see from the interstates from all around on the river, the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument on Libby Hill, finished in 1894. And then if you go over to what was not at the time Richmond, but became Richmond after 1910, to Manchester, the Elliott Grays have their own stone by the courthouse. In Manchester, now South Richmond. So for those of us who are Dogtowners, we have to recognize that there are monuments, simple ones, of course, it is Dogtown after all, on the south side of the river as well. So that's a quick tour of some of the monuments. It's an impressive number of monuments, more than I think most of you realize there are in Richmond. Doing a quick count this morning while walking my dog, there are more Confederate monuments in Richmond than all other monuments combined, which is significant in a lot of ways and significant certainly for the discussions today. All these monuments have been here for a while. If you talk about only those that are outside, only those of us who were born before 1928 can say that these monuments haven't always been there in our lives, 1929 rather. The latest one that I showed you of the external outdoor monuments in public spaces was that of Matthew Fontaine Maury from 1929. So they're they're familiar to us, and for a lot of us they're comfortable. They've always been here. And we don't usually question the when, the why, the how, the where, even the who behind the monuments that have always been there. But the rest of my program is going to be dedicated to just that the kind of question. I want to give a little bit on the backstories of some of these monuments right now. I think we all know intuitively that everything has a backstory. Every familiar building, every familiar statue. They didn't just happen. Someone had to put them there. And there's a reason why they put them there. And it's worth trying to recover those reasons. They didn't just spontaneously appear. So why are they there? Why are they where they are? All these questions. We are very fortunate, and I say yes, fortunate, to be living in a time where we get to witness up close and personal the process, like making sausage process, by which monuments appear on public spaces. Not just one, the Maggie Walker, which is in today's newspaper as well, but a second monument to Virginia women that will be appearing on someday soon on Capitol Square. So we get to have a front row seat in the process by which statues are erected on public spaces. And it can be messy. You know, issues like trees can come up and become completely unplanned sources of public debate, sometimes rancorous debate. So anytime there's a discussion about public space, public funds, there was likely to be public debate. Now, don't witness all this like I'm sure most of you do reading your papers and think, oh God, here we go again. Think of it as an opportunity to understand what goes into the process by which familiar monuments that we take for granted become familiar monuments and land and turn out to be where they are and how they are. Because virtually all of the monuments you see around you, these familiar monuments, involve the kind of messy public debate that we've seen and will see again in our own time. Now, I can't go into the backstories of many monuments, and let me just dip my toe in a few of them to give you kind of an idea about what I mean by backstories. So what and where is this? Well, a little backstory. After R.E. Lee died in 1870, it was a strong consensus among white Southerners and white Virginians that he deserved a monument, a big one too, in the former Confederate capital. But where exactly would it be and what would it look like? Several groups took the initiative. A women's group took the initiative and went so far as to engage a sculptor and had a competition, and they came up with this heroic monument that would be built on what is now Jefferson Hill Park on the east side of the city. What you see to your left as you're heading down Broad from this hill and going over to Church Hill, the hill on your left, this is what you would have seen frowning down upon you if the ladies had had their way. But the men's group didn't agree. And the then governor, before that, General Fitzhugh Lee, nephew of this Lee, stepped in and brokered a deal whereby the men got their way. And in 1890, Monument Avenue was kind of born with the unveiling of the monument where we know it, out on the Allen property west of town on Franklin Street Extended. And how about this crazy looking thing? A big temple. The Davis Monument, if those of you sitting close enough can see. The cornerstone for this was actually laid among great fanfare in 1896 at the Confederate Veterans Reunion. I don't know if it's still there, but the cornerstone was laid for this huge temple. A very influential group of veterans were honchoing this monument effort, and it proved to be a little too ambitious. And the ladies took over, and they came up with this idea instead, which was a memorial arch to be built over Broad Street at 12th Street, roughly where the transportation building is. This one ran into opposition because a very formidable person named Verena Howell Davis didn't like it, the widow of the president. So back to square one, and the ladies finally, the ladies of this organization, in fact, who were involved in the fundraising bazaar in 1903, and the Davis Monument, as we know it, was born at the corner of Cedar and Franklin Street in 1907. And then the old Soldiers and Sailors Monument I mentioned earlier, which on Church Hill. Some of you may have read an article that my wife Ruth Ann did a few years ago in the magazine about this monument. Long and the short of it is that this was to be the first among equals of all these courthouse monuments to soldiers and sailors that were springing up all over the South. A larger effort in the capital city. They engaged, a Veterans Committee engaged a very good sculptor, Sir Moses Ezekiel, a Confederate veteran and VMI cadet, Newmarket cadet. But his vision of it was a little more ambitious, that is, expensive, than the men had in mind. And they essentially, after much rancor, fired Sir Moses Ezekiel. And the shaft sat empty for several years until they hired William Ludwell Shepard, and it was finally unveiled in 1894. And how about this one? Anybody know who this guy is and where this monument is? Yeah, it looks like it could be. I always think he looked a bit like a spaniel to me. This is the monument to Samuel Preston Moore, the Surgeon General of the Confederacy. Somebody cared enough to form an association, hire a sculptor, but they couldn't push it over the top. It was never built. And what this tells you, so in other words, you're not missing anything here. What it tells you a little bit about these backstories will tell us. One thing is that there are almost always conflicts over location, design, and other specifics, even when there is no deep-seated conflict over the desirability of the project. Even when the only people involved in the project were white Southerners who revered the Confederacy and kind of hold that thought for later. There was conflict. Secondly, that the public landscape that we take for granted today not only didn't have to be that way, but almost wasn't that way. It's like take the signature Monument Avenue in Richmond. The first three monuments completed, Lee, Stewart, and Davis, were all originally to be located someplace else. And that was very typical for a lot of these monuments. They were to be located somewhere else. Monument Avenue was not planned as it is. It wasn't until after 1907 that there was a sense that, you know, we have something like a Monument Avenue here. Go ahead and add to it some more. Also, these stories really underscore the importance of the who. And I don't mean the who as in the statues commemorated, but the who as in the people who make these things happen or made them happen, the patrons. There is no Samuel Preston Moore monument, for whatever reason, because the people who were championing his monument didn't have enough influence or money to make it happen. And even with all the most influential people in Richmond and Virginia, the Jefferson Davis Monument ran into all kinds of trouble until it found the right patrons. Which brings us to the whole question of reading a monument, something that Tom put in the description of this talk and something that I've used in my talks as well. There are any number of ways of reading a monument, depending on the academic discipline you choose. An art historian will obviously look at a monument differently than an historian will, than a sociologist will. What I find most useful is a simple insight that I gleaned from the book by sociologist Jim Loewen. I think he gleaned it from somebody else. The book you have on your bibliography, Lies Across America, What Our Historic Sites Get Wrong. And he says that there are always three important perspectives in looking at a monument. And if I were as talented as Kelly Hancock, I would then go through and give you this one thing at a time appearing on the screen dissolving, but I can't. So you have it all there in front of you. And this is the only time you're ever going to see a slide with words on it from me. So you have reading a monument, and I'll be using these three perspectives as we go along. The perspectives that figure into making sense of a monument. The period commemorated, the period in which it was erected or conceived, and the period in which you are engaging with it. So first let's look at the first one, the period of the person or events being commemorated. We often hear in our discussions today and the debates that we're witnessing and will witness about monuments that removing monuments from the public landscape would be akin to erasing history, which suggests that monuments are history. That they are certainly artifacts of history, that is, they were products of another era. But are they artifacts of the Civil War era? Do they teach about Civil War history? Let's take, for example, the Lee Monument. If you were to come upon this for the first time in your life, what does a passerby to think of it? Well, it's a man on a horse. It's big. He must be important, or must have been important, but who is he and what did he do? Well, let's learn a little something. Let's look at the inscription. Lee. Boy, gee, that's helpful. And that's it. That's it. That's all it says. Lee. The message seems to be, if you don't know who he is, you don't belong here, do you? And I'm being a little bit facetious, but not really. Well, Stonewall Jackson, a little better. You may be able to see on the left side here on the eastern facade that it does at least identify the man, Stonewall Jackson. But it has a little bit on the front, too. It says, born 1824, killed at Chancellorsville, 1863. Well, the founders of our institution complained mightily about this. They tried to get it changed because it is untrue to history. Why? Why would the ladies get so wrapped around the axle about this?
He didn't die at Chancellorsville. He died a week or two later.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't killed. He was mortally wounded. And it was untrue to history. So you can't trust the history that you get on a monument. Well, Jeb Stuart, looking at the east side of the Jeb Stuart monument, you can't say that not any words on Jeb Stuart. Look at the main inscription. It gives you some good basic information about who he is, why he was important, maybe a hint of why he's there, although it does give the wrong date. It might have been built in 1906, but it wasn't placed right away. It wasn't placed till 1907, so a little bit of misinformation there too. But they make up for it with other biographical information about Jeb Stuart. He died age 31. He did all that in 31 years, like kind of the Mozart of the Confederacy. He gave his life for his country and saved this city from capture. And then on each side, North and south of the monument, there are quotes from Stonewall Jackson, quotes from R.E. Lee. So a lot of words on very helpful, good educational history lesson on Jeb Stuart. And then we come to Jefferson Davis Monument, which has lots of words on it. You have on the shaft right over his head, you've got the basics, President of the Confederacy. Okay, good. Now we know who he is, not some guy hailing a taxi cab. And along the colonnade, a quote from his resignation from the U.S. Senate in January of 1861 on both sides. And then comments about him, about what he did, but also with a lot of adjectives, with constancy and courage unsurpassed. He sustained the heavy burden laid upon him by his people. And on the other side, something similar, some information, but also a lot of good adjectives. Obviously, somebody who erected this monument liked him. But then a little bit on the Army and the Navy, Army on one side and the Navy on the other. 400 and some words in all about Jefferson Davis on that monument. The fact that it's got so many words on it is part of the reason why the Davis Monument is so controversial today, and the most controversial really of all the monuments on Monument Avenue. He's not a military hero, but a president, and so much of what's on the monument are things about the cause, the lost cause, which I meant to say, by the way, a few slides ago. I won't go back with that one about the slide of the monument of the proposed Jefferson Davis Monument had the Our Lost Cause on it. I want to stop and kind of go back to that for a moment because some people today think that verbiage, that terminology, is a modern terminology that's usually used to put down the Confederacy, that it's pejorative. But it was used by the Confederate generation itself to talk about their lost cause, and they used it with affection. So it is not some modern, pointy-head academic characterization of the Confederacy and Confederates. Today it is the body of thought generated by the Confederate generation is what academics use to refer to the lost cause, whereas the Confederate generation usually referred to simply their lost cause. And they're the ones who coined that phrase. So when I talk about it, please understand that. Well, back to generally about the Jefferson Davis Monument. There's a lot about the Jefferson Davis Monument that's important for reading a monument. The verbiage, the 400 and some words on Jefferson Davis, draw our attention to a fundamental distinction that we have to make in reading a monument. Perceiving the difference between when a monument offers objective facts about history. Think about these markers, what happened here. On this date in 1788, nothing happened, kind of thing. There's something that is informative about the past versus when the monument gives you a subjective, almost always, agenda-driven interpretation of history. So it may be history, but it's not a history that is presented objectively. We must ask ourselves, are monuments generally erected to simply acknowledge historical fact? This event happened here. Typically not. When you want to say that, you put up a marker, you put up a state historical marker of some kind. You don't go to the trouble of erecting something this grand just to say on this place or in this date something happened. Monuments are almost always to honor, to celebrate, to glorify a person or an event of the past. It is subjective. We tend to take monuments at face value as artifacts of the period being commemorated. Therefore, by that logic, Richmond's Confederate monuments are quote-unquote Civil War monuments. But is that really true? So let's jump to the second perspective, the period in which they were erected and conceived. I would submit that here in the Davis Monument and then here the Jeb Stuart Monument, the same weekend during a huge Confederate veterans reunion in Richmond, that these monuments really tell you more about the period in which they were conceived and erected than they do about the history. They tell you why that generation the fact that generation cared enough to erect them. So instead of taking a monument for granted, any monument anywhere for granted, you should ask yourself when you see one, why is it here? How did it get to be here? Why does it look the way it does? Why is it located exactly where it is? When was it erected? What was its historical context? And perhaps the most importantly, who made those decisions? Who put it there? Who made the decisions? Who was involved and who was not involved in the decision to put them there? who does and does not get to be on the what we historians and scholars generally now call the commemorative landscape. Who gets to be there, who doesn't get to be there, and who is involved in the decision, in that decision, is a fundamental question in reading any monument and in the debates over monuments. In short, it comes down to who owns history, or at least who owns the preservation and the presentation of history. So what is the historical context for Richmond's Confederate monuments? Most of them were erected by the Confederate generation itself, or the generation immediately following. In other words, the Confederacy was not then a distant, dim memory, but a visceral, lived experience. The monuments were products of a generation that felt intensely the loss of loved ones and the loss of a world and of a war and of a so-called way of life. We'll more on that later. A generation that felt the need to honor its dead and to demonstrate to the world their belief that they had fought and died for something noble. It was very much a product of that time. But another aspect of the historical context for Confederate monuments of that very same time frame is that white Southerners who revered the Confederacy held firmly and exclusively the reign of power. Was it coincidental that the Confederate monuments went up all over Richmond's public spaces, not just Monument Avenue as we've seen, during the era of Jim Crow segregation? It was not at all coincidental. I'll answer my own question. We must ask ourselves, would the landscape of Richmond, as we know it today, be so heavy in Confederate monuments if African Americans who felt so differently, who were concerned about slavery, who knew that the way of life of the Confederacy was wrapped up in slavery, would those monuments have gone up if they had been part of the body politic that had a role to play in the decision of whether or not public funds would be expended on these projects? I think you all know what the answer would be. We're essentially seeing the echo of that answer today in the demands that they be taken down. They would not have gone up to begin with. So what we have to accept, as not as a provocative statement trying to get your ire up, but as a simple factual statement, in part, these monuments are at least testaments to white supremacy. Because if it had not been for white supremacy, they would not have been there, at least not in the scale, at least not in the number that we know today. So the historical context of Jim Crow is critical, in addition to the historical context for this visceral sense of people trying to come to grips with loss of life and loss of a war. Those are both critical historical contexts. Which brings me to the third perspective about reading a monument. Those of us viewing it today, ideally, monuments should be transcendent. They should relate. This is from an editorial in Style magazine a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have read. They should relate to their communities, and when they're erected, they almost always do. But they should have transcendent value and relevance. Ideally, they should. But more often than not, they don't. Times change. Monuments don't say or mean the same thing to subsequent generations that they do to the people who erect them. That's just kind of a given. It's the rare monument that has transcendent value over time. The people who cared enough to raise the money, go to all the trouble to build the monuments, obviously cared a lot more, knew a lot more, felt a lot more than those generations subsequently. The word Lee was adequate in 1890. Everybody knew who that was. Not so much 100 and whatever it's been now, 26 years later. So what happens when the monument stops speaking to the public, or the public changes and the public hears different things than what was originally intended, hears things that are different and in fact objectionable? What should happen to these monuments? Do they remain relevant as history lessons, even if the lessons they're teaching, such as that being taught on the monument to Jefferson Davis, are now lessons that much of the public scorns and believes are erroneous historical lessons and erroneous interpretations of the public? Do we leave them there anyway, just because they tell us where we have been? They're relics of how a past generation felt about history? These are the kinds of questions we're grappling with today. It seems to me that this is exactly where we are today in our discussions and our debates over Confederate monuments. This is a discussion that's going to be challenging all of us, not only to exhibit diplomacy, patience, and I hope manners, but also it will require us to have the ability and the willingness to read monuments and to understand the role that they play and have played in our civic lives. Thank you all very much. for your attention. I think some of you may have to leave to go back to work, but those of you who don't, there is time for questions.
John, when did Monument Avenue become known as Monument Avenue?
I believe right about 1907. I should be, one of those sources, the book by Richard Guy Wilson, should have that in there, and I need to look it up. But I believe only with the dedication of the Stewart and Davis monuments in that year was it known. It was still Franklin Street for much of the 1890s on the maps that I've seen. Do you know, Eric? Is that?
I don't. I have to look that up.
Yeah. But it was only after those third statues got there that there was a sense that it was an apt description of what it had become. Please.
Since Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, was there any participation financially in any of these monuments from any of the other parts of the South other than local?
The state put up money for the Lee Monument, which is why about 15 years ago when Saad al-Amin was trying to defund the maintenance of the monuments through the city council, that the joke was on him because it wasn't, that's not maintained by the city, it's maintained by the state. But other cities, I don't know. I mean, Richmond, in its cemeteries and in its monuments as the former capital of Confederacy, in its fundraising efforts, would say that this city belongs to all of the South. And this museum, the Confederate Museum as it was then known, did the same thing in an effort not to be pigeonholed as a Richmond museum, trying to remind people and create a fundraising structure and an organizational structure that appealed to the wider South so that it wouldn't be mistaken as simply another local museum. And the same with Oakwood Cemetery. The dead of all states are buried here. You know, it is your obligation to give money for the upkeep of this cemetery, in which you Alabamians and you Louisianians, or your people, are buried here too. And Richmond made the same effort through the Davis Monument, through the Lee Monument in particular. Typically, a lot of monument efforts, even outside Richmond, try to appeal to a wider circle. But the Davis Monument, having the Central Committee of the Jefferson Davis Monument Association, was the national committee, the UDC eventually. And the Lee, same thing. They were chartered nationally, and they had the fundraising capacity much the same way we have to fill out these forms to be able to raise funds in other cities and other states. So they did play on the national element, that Richmond was, anything in Richmond was necessarily a southern-wide effort. And I think the short answer to your question is yes, but they weren't unique in that. But I think Richmond was able to do that more successfully, having been the capital of the Confederacy. Please, Tom.
Was it a tough fight to get it down in there?
I don't know about the tough fight, but once again, your question about Union monuments draws attention, in Richmond and Petersburg, draws attention to the importance of patrons of the who made it happen. The monuments in Petersburg are an extension of the monuments on battlefields. Since Petersburg itself was a battlefield as such, it reflects that same impetus, the same sort of organizational thing that we saw in all the monuments that litter Gettysburg, and I don't use litter in a pejorative sense, that dot the landscape of most battlefields. Regimental associations, brigade associations, survivors associations, raising monuments either to themselves, to the men of the 36th Wisconsin, or to our commander who fell, an equestrian statue of the commander of the 36th Wisconsin, who fell on the battlefield. And the men who made it happen were the men who served under him, the survivors. That's more typical of Petersburg, and certainly and why there are so many Union monuments on battlefields, even in the South. And for that, there was a lot of resentment in the South. Why are they coming down here? They're invading us a second time. They're putting up their blasted monuments. But by then, they were national parks. So it made it easy. The only ones in Richmond that would qualify in the suburbs, somewhere out in Hanover or Henrico, there's a monument to a Wisconsin unit, which is why that came to mind. And then, of course, we have down at Tredegar, a monument to Lincoln. Not to a general, but to a leader. And it hasn't been that long, 13 years now, since that was erected, and the Sturm und Drang that was involved with that in trying to place a monument to the President of the United States during the American Civil War somewhere in Richmond. But to generals, not to my knowledge. A historic marker that this museum had something to do with helping to raise on the outskirts of town, the point at which the Union troops entered Richmond on April 3rd, 1865, and we were one of the co-sponsors of the Blue Coats in the Gray City initiative that through the commemorative march raised the money for a Department of Historic Resources tablet saying on this spot this happened. That's the closest that I can think of. I'm not sure in any of the cemeteries. Of course, there are in the national cemeteries, particularly the one on Williamsburg Road within the city boundaries in Seven Pines out in Hanover and Henrico County. The national cemeteries and monuments to the dead in those cemeteries are the closest we come. And I think in part, if there had been fighting in the streets of Richmond and Union men had died, historians usually dodge questions of counterfactual history, but I'll answer this one. If there had been deaths of a military nature within what is now the city of Richmond, I think it's safe to say that the survivors of that unit and the admirers of that person would have erected a monument to at least a stone of some kind. But since nothing like that happened in Richmond, as did happen in Petersburg, there are no such monuments. I see what you mean. So you cited the example of the Arthur Ashe Monument, which had patrons, Arthur Ashe's family, heavy hitters in the community of Richmond. But you'll note, of course, that there was, to my knowledge anyway, no fundraising effort for the Arthur Ashe Monument. And of course, it was certainly the public was very much engaged in the debate. It was in many ways, if you read the account of one of the public debates, for those of you who weren't in Richmond at the time, in the book by Tony Horowitz, which is on your reading list, he happened to be here in researching for Confederates in the Attic during that debate. And Richmond comes off looking pretty good, frankly, for a divisive and sometimes nasty, but for the most part, searching deep, important debate on deep and important issues. And a lot went into that debate. And it was divisive, but it was also in many ways constructive because a lot of the things that came out of it and the effort to go through this process. So in some ways, it was almost a model for why public debate is important, if only to bring things to the forefront, things that may remain unsaid, that were said. But today, the way we go about building monuments, to some degree from top down, particularly in the initiative and the fundraising stage and of course the use of public funding, which should necessitate public involvement, but it's not the kind of to open up the to put out a notice and to solicit funds for monuments the way it was in an earlier era. So to some degree, the times have changed. What I think they were talking about in this webinar to which you were referring about monuments, it was sponsored by the American Association of State and Local History, is the importance of public involvement, as you were observing in the discussion of it. It should reflect, to some degree, public will, and especially regarding that third point I was making about relevance to the people now or looking into the future. Will that monument continue to be relevant? Will it have the design that makes it relevant? Will it have, is this project going to have relevance? Or is it simply something that years from now people will eat their lunches and the pigeons will land on it and somebody every now and then will say, I wonder who this guy is anyway, which is the fate of most monuments. Ideally, that shouldn't happen, typically does, and so up front there should be discussion to make sure that it's placed right, it's designed right, and that it continues to have relevance. For my money, the one in the city of Richmond that does that the best is this one, the Civil Rights Monument in Capitol Square. It links an historic event, the student strike in Prince Edward County, in Barbara Johns, an historic event in 1951, I believe, and it's very much at eye level, which is the trend and tendency nowadays for monuments. It links it to, and this quote, there's a quote on the other side. Did I not use that? I didn't. But look at the quote from Thurgood Marshall. The legal system can force open doors and sometimes even knock down walls, but it cannot build bridges. That job belongs to you and me. From the attorney who handled the cases. He's one of the people in Barbara John. So the historical quote was something, and you look at the dress, and of course years from now, people are going to wonder, why these guys have their hats on backwards? What were they thinking back then? Why are they dressed that way? But for now, and some maybe generation into the future, it looks like you and me. So it succeeds in bridging an historical event with time. I look at that, and it literally and figuratively, it speaks to me in the second person, the direct address. And it's very effective. So here's an effort to try to make a monument continue to be relevant and not become simply a pigeon perch in the years in the future, much less an object of controversy. You know, the fate of most monuments is not to become the subject to the kind of divisive debate that we are seeing now and will be seeing even more so in the future. We've only seen the beginning of this dialogue. But most of the time their fate is to become irrelevant. And so part of that public involvement is to decide its relevance. And of course one thing being discussed now for Richmond's monuments is how to make Confederate monuments that were erected by people not only who felt more viscerally and thought more and cared more about a period of time than we do today, but because that process by which those monuments were erected excluded people whose descendants now are the plurality anyway, the population of this city, how to make them relevant and inoffensive. Because at the time they were erected, they were obviously celebrating the Confederacy and whitewashing it, mentioning not at all the slavery, something that mattered deeply to the people who were not involved in the process. And in a sense, it's not the pigeons, but the chickens have come home to roost in this exclusion of part of the population. The African-American population in the 1890s and 1920s didn't have a chance to say anything about them, but they do now. And they're saying more or less what their ancestors would have said if they had had a chance. So now it's the people who erected them and their descendants who are on the defensive, trying to somehow make these relevant and inoffensive to a modern population. So it shows that dynamic, that change over time. So there's two things, long answer to your question, is two things about community involvement. One is the upfront involvement, and the other now is what to do about. And you and I have had this discussion about what we do and do not do in this country. We are not like the Soviet Union. We are not like the Taliban. We do not destroy monuments. That has been our tendency as a people. But we're facing a challenge to that now, as New Orleans illustrates. You know, in the past, my safe, comfortable answer has been to point out what happened in Annapolis, Maryland, where on one side of the Capitol is a monument to Justice Roger Taney, the man who articulated and handed down the decision in I want to say Plessy versus Ferguson, the Dred Scott decision. And there was movement beginning in the 70s, 60s, and 70s and 80s to remove that monument. What is Justice Taney on the front steps of the Capitol? Well, after much discussion, they came up with another solution, which is to put up on the other side of the Capitol, and the beautiful Capitol building in Annapolis, several sides actually, a monument to the other Maryland-born Supreme Court justice named Thurgood Marshall, to balance the landscape. And that has always seen the more American solution, if you will, hence the Arthur Ashe Monument, and hence Maggie Walker. And before last June, I would have said that is what everyone thought and everyone would approve. But we're in a very changed world now, and a world in which, yeah, we may, as a nation, take a step towards something more like the Taliban, more like the Soviet Union. And so the community involvement is now just whether we want to take that step as a nation. Okay, one more question?
Quick one. How did, when these major monuments went up, Confederate monuments went up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what was the play in the Northern press about
Good question. And thank you for asking. One thing I do in my other version of this talk is more on that. There was a certain amount of criticism, particularly in the African American press, locally and nationally, about this being a backward step. We are reunited. We should not be celebrating this dead past, this divisive past. Now, of course, the Union was putting up monuments everywhere. But it kind of echoes a question that you hear today over and over. Why are all these Confederate monuments here? I mean, who allowed that? Now, to those of us who have lived here or grown up here, they're part of the landscape. I mean, what do you mean who allowed it? The people wanted to do it and we did it. The people. We know better than to think that it was all the people, but who was going to stop us? Well, think about the losers in civil wars. I made this point the other day in another context. Think about the losers in other civil wars. How often did they get to erect monuments to their heroes? Much less, much to their dead, much less monuments on prominent public boulevards. And as many as I've shown you today and as shown on that sheet, how many other losers in the civil wars have had the privilege granted by the people who beat them, to erect all those monuments? I'm not putting a value judgment on this now. I'm just saying historical experience. How often does that happen? So there was a certain amount of incredulity in the North about, okay, is this, I'm seeing some warning signs now, folks. Are they ready to secede again? There was a lot of fear right after the war, particularly among Union veterans, that their job wasn't done yet. We don't think these rebels are pacified. So we're keeping our hands on our guns if we have to go back. But it blew over and no one was worried. But when the monuments started going up, there was a certain amount of fear that this indicated a new rebellious spirit in the South. Thank you.